This episode of A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects. Created by Bloomberg philanthropists, Bloomberg Connects is the free app that lets you access museums, galleries and cultural spaces around the world on demand. Download Bloomberg Connects to access digital guides and explore a variety of content. Hello, I'm Ben Luke, and welcome back to A Brush With, the podcast where I talk to artists about their influences and cultural experiences and the way that they affect their life and work. This episode is A Brush With Tracey Rose. Tracey is an important figure in recent art from South Africa. She was born in Durban in South Africa, and as you'll hear, she had an eventful childhood, going to a convent school which made a huge impression on her and in fact has been reflected in her work. She studied at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg and graduated in 1996 and actually achieved some success on the international art stage before doing her master's at Goldsmiths College in London, graduating in 2007. She currently lives in Johannesburg. Tracey works in a variety of media, but is best known for her performances and video. And as a young artist, she established her practice in quite a dramatic way in a series of very powerful performances that placed her own body at the centre. In a 1996 work, Titled, which means untitled, she filmed herself on CCTV, shaving off all her body hair in a bathroom. Then, in 1997, at the second Johannesburg Biennial, she performed naked with a shaven head in a cabinet, slowly knotting and weaving her hair together. In the video installation TKO, meaning Technical Knockout, from 2000, she filmed herself naked on surveillance cameras again, but this time in a boxing ring attacking a punch bag, and actually she'd learned to box for several years beforehand. These extreme works were made in the immediate aftermath of the end of Apartheid in South Africa and inevitably were provocative in drawing attention to issues of gender and in particular in relation to the black body. The year after TKO, Tracey made a hugely ambitious work which riffed on Leonardo's Last Supper, and that was called Ciao Bella. It appeared at the Venice Biennale organised by the legendary curator Harold Zeeman in 2001. And in that work, using extreme costumes and makeup, she performed the roles of 13 women to represent Christ and the disciples, from fictional characters like Nabokov's Lolita to historical figures like Marie Antoinette and Saartjie Baartman, who was a 19th century South African woman who was brought to the UK and paraded in freak shows. Ciao Bella set the tone for many of Tracey's works since then, in establishing the role of the absurd and the carnivalesque alongside that rigorous commitment to issues of race and gender. Increasingly, the reference points in her work have grown more complex, and she draws together disparate threads from art, from political theory, and from much more in often long performances. Two recent pieces reflect this growing attention to research. For the Performer Biennial in New York in 2017, Tracey created a piece called The Good Ship Jesus versus the Black Star Line, which on the one hand referenced the first slave ship carrying Africans to the Americas, and then on the other hand evoked the ill-fated shipping line which was founded by the Pan-Africanist political leader Marcus Garvey. That piece also referenced Black Power movements in the US, and the set for the performance conjured the black and white television which Tracey and her family grew up watching in South Africa. Then at the recent Sharjah Biennial, Tracey created Any Way the Wind Blows, another complex work reflecting on her family history, which was set in the Sharjah Ladies Club ice rink. Now, in that work, as well as Atlantic histories, Tracey examined the East African and Indian Ocean slave trade, into which her father's ancestors had been sold. And this was all told through the presence of Garvey's ghosts. And to add a further layer of complexity, Any Way the Wind Blows is a reference to a lyric in that Queen song Bohemian Rhapsody, and is a nod to the Queen singer Freddie Mercury's ancestry in Zanzibar. The presence of Garvey's ghost is indicative of the increasing prominence of spirituality and spiritual ideas in Tracey's recent work, and often woven into these collective and personal histories. She's arguably at the most creative moment in her career so far, hence a new retrospective at the Zeitz Mocha Gallery in Cape Town, which is organised by the Zeitz director and leading curator Koyo Kuo, who you'll hear Tracey talk about in the interview. That show was actually due to open in 2020, but was postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic and is scheduled for February 2021. Now, before we begin the interview, Tracey stopped in the middle of it to explain her use of a problematic word, coloured. Here she is explaining why she uses that term.
I say within South Africa, I'm coloured. I mean, I would have said African all along. I still do, but there's this moment right now where that's become politically charged again. So I've got to re-investigate it, and I'm starting to say that in ways that I've never had before. And as opposed to when I travel and I'm black, I'm African, I'm black, and that's it. There's no complication there. But here it's still fraught. So we actually haven't really dealt with the intricacies of the racism of the past.
Now to the interview. I began by asking Tracey about the role of absurdity in her work, and if it was particularly useful in tackling major social and geopolitical subjects.
I suppose as a sort of get out of jail free card. I use it. I think it's easy to laugh at and incredibly serious and disturbing, provocative issues. And I prefer that as a reaction, as an initial reaction. It's I think laughter is quite seductive. So in that space, you kind of ease any kind of aggression or I suppose animosity or kind of negative reaction to which I use it as a self-protective device rather than as anything really strategic in a more sort of social kind of space. You know what I mean? It's purely self-preservatory.
That's great. And one of the ways in which that sort of manifests itself through the work is through costume and makeup and the painting of the body. Can you say something about the way that you use that and what sort of visual role they play in your work?
I mean, I'm a frustrated painter, so, and a frustrated sculptor. So, I mean, it's kind of a way of working that sort of magic with my hands and taking that flattened surface or the 3D surface. And the first works where I started doing the body painting, because prior to that, it was the naked form. It was the body as a tool, as a medium, as a form in space, as a sort of political device. I mean, it's kind of looking at myself really as this charged tool or medium. And for me, the kind of sort of turning point was when I did TKO, which was looking at painting quite formally. I trained as a professional boxer for 4 years before I did that piece, or 2 years, I can't remember. But I didn't actually get in the ring with anybody because I honestly cannot take a punch. I wanted to emulate the mark making of Monet's water lilies, and for me the punching was a way of kind of of dabbing the paint onto the canvas, and the actual structure of the space was a white cube that was deconstructed into a sort of two-dimensional form, which was a reference to cubism. So, I mean, this is not really answering a question, but like I'm saying, like directly, I'm kind of going the long route. For me, that moment was really quite cathartic when I created that work, because it just was the culmination of so much investigation and just a good few years of frustration. And and also the final piece ended up as an installation, so it was like I wanted the audience to walk into the artwork, to feel the artwork, to be part of it. So there's like considerations of where the projector's gonna be placed and the angling of the screen and all of that. And then immediately afterwards is Ciao Bella, which starts with the body painting and the sort of more absurdist kind of performance and performativity, and that was a way to find out how to merge childhood trauma, play, fantasy in a space. But the impetus behind also the choice of the Last Supper with Ciao Bella was the first drawing I did where I discovered that I was an artist, and I kind of was affirmed to be that, was when I was in grade 1, and I'd gotten into a all-white convent school because my dad had a meeting with the bishops when I think we'd gone to visit America on this sort of fly now, pay later sort of scheme. And my dad had heard Archbishop Hurley talking about the Catholic Church not being racist and having all of these different schools, but what he didn't make clear was that the schools weren't integrated, that you had a colored Catholic school, an Indian Catholic school, black, white Catholic schools. And so when we returned from the States, my dad called a meeting with the bishops, and my father wanted to be a priest, so he's like, pretty well respected, and he basically told them that the Catholic churches were anti-Christ because they practiced racism and they weren't integrated. So I was one of the first kids, I was the guinea pig to be let into this, into the white Catholic school. And this is like primary school and high school. And it was pretty fucking traumatic. Absolutely racist bitches. And everybody, including my teacher. And nobody explained this shit to me. I ended up there, and my first day at school, I'm wearing this white dress and this big bow in my hair, and these bobby socks. And the teacher was an absolute racist bitch, yelled at my mum for not having, me not being in school uniform. There's all this kind of racial tension and trauma with all of these little bitches. And then we had to draw the Last Supper. And my mom, my sister said to me, let mommy draw you, do the drawing, because we all knew my mother was the artist in the family. So, she does the drawing, and I take it to school. Everybody's comparing theirs, and they see mine, and they're like, oh, this is amazing. Who did it? And my sister had told me, don't tell anybody that it wasn't you, say it was you. So I was like, I did it. And they were like, oh, great. And they started pulling out their Last Suppers from their little religious instruction books and asked me to do the drawings for them. And I was terrified. And all I did was follow the mark that my mother had made in my book. And then I was like, baptized as the artist in the year. And from then on, the sort of levels of respect I received were completely different to before that. And so that was when I realized what the duty and the normity and the gravity and, and the benefit of art was. So, going back, with Child Bella was going back to that moment of the Last Supper and the sort of reenactment of some of these characters. It was quite an intuitive way that I approached that. So I was in Cape Town and I was with a friend of mine. We were having dinner and I was showing him the sketch that I'd made of the table and the characters that I was going to have in Child Bella. And I hadn't yet titled it, and I was still sort of working on it. And, the immediacy of drawing is that, it's not mediated. So it's, straight from your sort of energetic point into the pen, onto the page. And I said, I need 2 years to really interrogate this and actually get it out. And he said to me, well, why don't you just trust yourself? And I thought that was the craziest thing. Nobody ever told me that. And I remember looking at Table Mountain because the restaurant was quite near. And I looked at it and I said to myself, I said to the mountain, to my ancestors, I was like, if you exist, then I'm giving this over to you. And, and that was the invitation to Siemens' 2001 Venice Biennale, which is a quite risky thing to do. I'd never done that before. And it was amazing. It was like the work actually made itself. So all of these characters were kind of generated within the process. So initially I was going to get a friend of mine to be my costume mistress, but she had a crack habit and she was kind of stealing materials. So I had to fire her. And then I was left without anybody. And my mom was around. And I was like, I'm kind of desperate. Would you want to do this? And she said, fuck, of course. I thought you'd never ask. And she was amazing. She just finished my sentences. And I remember at one point I said to her, you're not my mother. You were my employee, basically. She's like, you don't have to be so mean. And she was just so incredible. And it was kind of also this really strange sort of rebirthing of our relationship also in that space. And, I got hooked. I got hooked on the hyper color, the intensity of gesture. We shot that video in 3 days. I think I scripted it and worked on everything over 3 months, from sort of concept to conception to execution, which I find is also just absurd terminology that we use in the art world. We conceive a work and then we execute it. And so and kind of having these sort of two kind of, I don't know, versions, I suppose, in my palette box of that I could play with, this sort of black and white, quite sort of minimalistic, and now into this full blown cacophony of color and sound and absurd. It was a bit of an enema just to kind of get that, get into that space of self-expression.
Let's move on to the questions that we ask all our guests. Who was the first artist whose work you loved?
Monet. Yeah, it was the first time I saw the water lilies was somewhere in the 90s. And I'm saying somewhere in the 90s because I think it's roped off now. But I was like 2 centimeters away from the surface of the canvas. And I just wanted to take my eyeballs out and just roll it along. You know, it's just this commitment to this mark and to color and the expanse of the surface. You know, and there's this joy just in just making. Yeah, I'm going to say Picasso as well, but yeah, no, it's I think that the machismo element has put me off over the years.
But it's really interesting because Monet has become so detached from his initial radicalism, you know, and it's really interesting that you somehow kind of occupied that space of his of how kind of profound what he was doing was. He's become such a chocolate box artist. It's so easy to dismiss him as a serious artist these days, sadly. When you saw his work, you say it's in the 90s, so you were sort of in your 20s, right, when you had this experience with Monet. So you would, I guess you're aware that you were aware at that time of his reputation, as it were, as a kind of, you know, in Europe especially, he seems particularly associated with a kind of almost a conservatism in art.
Well, you know, my experience of artworks, I mean, outside of going to like the Johannesburg Art Gallery and others, yeah, I suppose I didn't really even go to the commercial spaces because I found them so intimidating. But was during my entire kind of art history education, we used to view really washed out ancient slides. So all the colors were like this yellow, you know, kind of off whites and bleached out, and yeah, and then, you know, obviously you don't get into scale and all of that if you're looking in books. But my experiences with artwork, and I think this is probably why I love video so much. My experiences with artwork was as light, you know, as not as matter and material and stuff, you know. So, you know, just seeing that, you know, I don't want to say it's more of a sort of formal enjoyment, because that just sanitizes the experience. But I mean, it was it was bliss, man. It was so lush. Oh my fuck, my eyeballs were like overjoyed.
Which historical artist do you turn to the most today?
Duchamp. And that goes back to this crazy, wonderful professor who Rory Dupel, and he would show like 1,000 slides in a lecture. He'd have like all the slide projectors full and all of them going at the same time. I don't know, there were like 6 in the back. And I used to sit in the front of his class and just weep. And his theory was Duchamp and the Dadists were practicing Kabbalists. So everything that they did was based on the Kabbalah. And so, you know, the elements of magic and alchemy that come into the work. So it's not just art for art's sake. This is magic and alchemy that we're dealing with. And, you know, that's attached to spirit. And you know, I don't know about international institutions, but we also studied African art, you know, the African art objects, not in contemporary African art, because that was barely covered, but, you know, the sort of a more kind of anthropological look at the way that objects were created throughout Africa, because a couple of our lecturers, professors, were sort of specialists in that. I mean, I think their work is somewhat problematic now, but and what joy I found with that was that, you know, art wasn't just about creating an image and decor, and it was a far more innate impetus. And I found that with Duchamp, I mean, he was the first white male artist that wasn't using a paintbrush. I mean, I call it cock art because really it is. It's just like painting with your fucking dick. I mean, that's all we've been fucking subjected to, is just cock art. So, you know, and he has this person working with stuff that was charged. It wasn't just intellectually charged, it was spiritually charged. And I love that. I love that the work was alive and invigorated with a duty to do something bigger than itself, you know?
Well, I think one of the intriguing things about Duchamp is because he's still the name I would say most artists seem to be able to mine in all sorts of different ways, and what you derive from Duchamp might be totally different from, say, Ronnie Horn, who we spoke to, who also admires Duchamp tremendously. It seems to me he just sets artists free in all sorts of directions. Would that be fair?
Yeah, but I mean, like, look at that point. I mean, it was like the turn of the century. They've been exposed to so much from all over the world, and they start to question their reality within this very constrained space. And by doing so, they use the tools and the gifts, I would say, from other kind of lineages. And for me, like, Duchamp is probably the most African you can get in terms of European art, because I feel like his work embodies the spirit so much. And that's why I also think that when you look at a lot of contemporary African art and the way that, we use matter and material, it's not... obviously because there's really practical economic issues. So, you can't really get the high end stuff. In terms of paints or whatever. So you find other ways and other sort of creative visual material metaphors to create the work. And I feel that he has validated that space,
That's really interesting. Let's talk about contemporary artists. Which contemporary artists do you most admire?
Carlos Capellan. I assisted him when he was on the first Joburg Biennale, and I say the scales fell from my eyes because I was quite close to him and his assistant when they were working. And there was this beautiful moment when they wouldn't give him the space that he'd requested. And so he was at the coffee shop, like busy just working on it, and I wanted to go and sit with him, and his assistant called me to sit with him, and then I said to him, like, what is he doing? And he said he's reconceptualizing the space. And I was like, why? He's like, well, he wasn't given the space that he was told he would get initially, so now he's going to reconfigure the entire artwork. And I was fucking gobsmacked because it showed, what he does. This is serious shit. You can't just take a work and transplant it somewhere else. There's a multitude, and that for me goes back to the kind of sort of Duchampian moment where you consider every aspect. If you're going to have a rhinoplast wall as opposed to a brick wall, it says something very different. And considering, entrance spaces that have now changed to all of these like micro elements, what the plug in the wall is going to be, where's it going to be? It just like, that was like a really formative moment. It was also just like, he was kind of mentor, silent mentor. He didn't know it. Just by engaging with him and talking. Yeah. So Carlos Capellan, Adrian Piper, who I was exposed to I think fourth year. I was a professor, African-American professor on a Fulbright scholarship in the History of Art department, Dr. Robin Chandler. And her classes were on African-American art and culture, and I attended like every single one of her classes, even though I wasn't registered for her course. And we became really good friends, and she introduced me to Adrian Piper. The calling card work just brought me to tears. Lorraine O'Grady, who I only met, actually we haven't also just physically, maybe sort of being in a 2-person exhibition at the Goodman Gallery a few years back. And I hadn't actually known about her work, and also just another incredible artist. And David Hammonds, I was with the Project Gallery in New York, and I was the youngest artist in the gallery, and so everybody around me were just such incredible artists. It's Coco Fusco, Daniel Martinez, William Pope L, and Pope L now, Paul Pfeiffer, Julie Moretu, Corey Newkirk. So, like really, really strong, good artists, who just feed me. I mean, it's just, it's like being at an art buffet. I mean, that's probably a disgusting thing to say.
I'd like to talk a bit about artist peers, because there was you did an Instagram live with Koyo Kuo recently, and you started to say something really interesting, and then Koyo interrupted you. So I want to follow up on it, because you said that when you were exhibiting, I think this must have been in the sort of 2000s, and you were being invited to lots of international shows. And one of the hallmarks of that moment was that you weren't being paid. You were sort of essentially being brought over and sort of almost employed without any payment and expected to do public talks and expected to do all the things that one expects of an artist, but not actually being remunerated for it. And within that context, you established a kind of a peer group, you suggested that you and other artists were talking about this as a kind of major thing. And I wanted to talk a bit about that moment and about was there a sense in which there was this great apparently globalist project happening in the early 2000s that actually was deeply problematic in terms of its attitude to artists and what it expected of artists?
I mean, it actually started in the mid-90s. Well, my experience with it started in the mid-90s. It probably got a bit more polished in the course of the later 2000s. I think where artists were demanding that they get paid. I would ask to do workshops or lectures at local institutions so that I could get paid that way. I was also getting experience just teaching. The one thing I say is that I'm militant about art and I'm militant about education. And that was just amazing to also just see different ways that art education was taught in just different institutions just globally. I think there was also just a desperation on our parts, and we kind of knew that if the work didn't get out there, there wasn't going to be a global shift. And it was almost like you just had to swallow it, I mean, there were points where you could sort of make demands or you could ask, but there was also the possibility that you would be blocked off a show because you were asking for funds that didn't exist, for example. In some cases, there weren't any funds, so they would pay for you just your plane ticket and your hotel accommodation. You were lucky if you got a per diem. I mean, also the thing is, it still happens today. I was thinking about that earlier, of just how savagely disrespectful that is, because we all have side gigs, we all do other things in order to survive, and it's almost supposed to be some kind of rite of passage or some sort of merit award if you can survive this moment and say, I do this because I can't do anything else. If I have to look too hard at that moment, I'll probably burst into tears because it was incredibly hard for so many of us. I mean, we were sleeping on each other's couches. I mean, it's kind of what all artists in all kind of art fields do, whether you a dancer, musician. It's almost as though this is your trial by fire, your rite of passage. And I don't know if it's valid or not, or necessary at all. I mean, like I said, it still happens. So it's not like it's in the past. And I think that it's just something that really needs to be worked on internationally and locally, in our spaces. We've got to find ways to ensure that, artists aren't always, living from hand to mouth.
So we talked about lots of artists, but do you have any art pinned to your studio wall? Yes,
I have Lala Kunst. Lala Kunst is the work my son does. His name's Luandle, but his nickname's Lala. And so his work just brings me such joy. He's such a good artist. He's so much better than I will ever be. He actually did one of my artworks. He and Victoria Northorn's son collaborated on the wall drawing in the piece I did in Buenos Aires. But we were walking into the elevator and I was like, "Oh, look, there's Mummy's name." And he was like, "And where's my name?" And he refused to speak to me for an hour because he wasn't credited. And his work is just awesome. It's so awesome. Like, he's like my best critic. Yeah.
This episode of A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects. The app offers access to numerous cultural institutions through a single download. One of the guides that you'll find on the app allows you to follow The Line, the public art walk in London that runs from the Greenwich Peninsula to Stratford in East London, along waterways including the River Thames and the Royal Docks, following the Greenwich Meridian. The guide to The Line on Bloomberg Connects allows you to get closer to the artist's vision, so you'll hear introductions by leading figures including Anthony Gormley, Laura Ford and Thomas Price to the works along the line, and then, if you want to know more, deep dives take you further into the pieces and the artist's thinking. For instance, Larry Achampong speaks about his sound work Sanko Time, which connects the Meridian in London with Accra, the capital of Ghana, through Achampong's narration and a series of oral histories, which are moving testimonies from members of the black community. Sanko Time was made for the 20-minute round trip on the cable car from the Greenwich Peninsula to the Royal Docks, and you can hear it in its entirety on the app. Inevitably, the stories Achampong illuminates reflect on the slave trade and the continuing racism that's fed into the Black Lives Matter protests of recent years. For more content and to explore guides to all the partnering institutions, download Bloomberg Connects today. You can find the app at app.bloombergconnects.org/abrushwith. Now let's talk about museums and galleries. Which museum or gallery do you visit most frequently?
Side Smoker. Yeah, I was thinking about it. It's like I haven't even gone to the Joburg Art Gallery as often as I've gone to Side, but that's also because I'm installing the show. We keep going down for meetings and stuff, and so it's hands down the museum I've been visiting the most frequently.
Obviously having a show there, that inevitably means you go there. But one of the things about Zeitsmoker is it said it's a contemporary gallery, not just for South Africa, but for Africa. That's a bold ambition, isn't it? So does it achieve it? Does it feel like a sort of Pan-African space as much as it is, a particular local gallery in Cape Town?
Well, now that Koya's directing, yeah. I would never have entered there if she wasn't there. I was sort of boycotting the space when it first opened. So not that I was included. And actually the fact that I was completely overlooked was one of the reasons I actually didn't hold it in high regard at all. And I think it was highly problematic before. And since she's taken over the directorship of it, it's incredible. It feels like home, But Koya's also got the ability to do that. She kind of makes everybody feel like family, and that you're visiting the village, and that's really what it's like. It's like I know Storm, who's the head curator. I know him, so I love that about a lot of the museums that I love. They're all headed by people I love, and I love like Reina Sofia. It's also just one of those the spaces where you feel like family. And I think that, also kind of going back to that space in the early 2000s where we weren't being paid and compensated. It felt okay because somehow, even in those spaces, when I used to have conversations with head curators and museum directors at the time, and it'd be like, this is challenging, but we know it is financially challenging, but we know that it is really important that you all show your work here. And it was kind of thinking like the Kunsthal in Bern, and like Bernard Fabicher was the director at the time, and if those things hadn't happened, if we'd said no, if the money was the deciding factor, a lot of great things wouldn't have come out of those, amazing conversations. It was the first time this was the Bern exhibition. I think it started off in Accra and then it moved over to Bern. Was that I'd met I'd met other African artists from outside of South Africa, who were exhibiting internationally. African art exhibitions are like the best parties. It's like family gatherings. They're just amazing. The food, the music, the conversation. Everything is just so incredible, and that allows for some kind of balm, I guess, for the financial traumatic side of it.
Which cultural experience changed the way you see the world?
That would be the first Johannesburg Biennale. It was like the scales fell from my eyes. It was the first time I'd experienced artists of color who were not European or American, who were making art using stuff. And the stuff spoke, they were energized, they were magic, they were alchemic, And I also, it sounds really naive to say this, but I realized like how bad apartheid was. It had kept us from so much. And I just wept for a year. I used to go into Carlos Capelan's installation and just crawl into the little room, cave-like room that he'd made that we'd painted with mud using our hands, and I would just cry because it was just, oh God, I'm actually starting to feel emotional about that now. Yeah, it was really intense to just kind of see the level of deception. You know, I mean, it wasn't just, you know, we'd figure out ways to move and, you know, evolve in this space, but, you know, to, you know, just seeing the level of deception and how deep it ran and the control. I mean, you know, kind of all systems in my mind at that point just not just crumbled. They just disintegrated. Just to see the sort of systematic control of people within a space and what the alternative would look like, what sort of liberation would look like. I mean, that was 95. So it's like a year.
It was just a year after the end of apartheid, right?
Yeah. So it was really extreme. And I mean, you know, when I was studying, I was the only coloured female student throughout my 4 years.
And you've been weaving your background and your family history into your work quite a lot recently, haven't you?
For me, I'm looking at not just myself now, I'm kind of looking at my mother's lineage, which is indigenous African. And then I'm looking at my dad's, which a lot of the archives, not even archives, just a lot of fucking information's been lost because, so what I do is I go to different sources. So yeah, before I do what I call ghetto research, I just listen to people's stories and kind of assimilate that and then follow it up with some research and see what I could find. And the thing is, you know, when I started making art, it was pre-internet, so a lot of that was going to the library, or I used to go to the bookstore, Exclusive Books here, and I'd have like borrow 20 Rand for my dad, 10 Rand for parking, all day parking, and the other 10 Rand for a bottomless cup of coffee. And I would just go into the bookstore and take a pile of books and I'd speed read and just drink coffee in the coffee shop the whole day. And they were amazing. I mean, I was, you know, it was like visiting the contemporary section of a library, which just doesn't exist here. Now, one of the other forms of research that I'm doing is, okay, so I've got this calling to be a traditional healer, which people call sangomas here, I call them shamans there. But I mean, most artists are. But the good artists are that. I mean, I think Duchamp was a shaman, which is why I absolutely love his work, because I believe he was totally connected to that. I think that if he'd had more sort of time and access to other spaces and resources, he would have gone more in depth into African art practices and not just, you know, stayed within the framework of the Kabbalah. So yeah, so I consult, you know, shamans, sangomas, psychics, whatever. I've spoken to a couple of sangomas, and the one said, "Oh, your family used to be advisors to the gods." So I mean, we're not talking about this sort of timescape, you know, which is why I love sort of stretching out these kind of these parameters, because if you advise us to the gods, I mean, I can't even fucking fathom what that means. And he wasn't the first shaman who told me that. Somebody else had told me the same thing, which I kind of feel makes sense. My dad wanted to be a priest and being so Catholic. Both of my parents are. My mom, she was a Eucharistic minister, so she would kind of give the church service. Then they were sold into slavery, and they were on the East Coast, so they ended up on the island of Mauritius and the sugarcane fields. And then she said, then they came back through the wilderness on a long journey. And the journey was my grandfather coming back when he was 9 years old with his sister and his dad on the boat back to African mainland. And they ended up in Durban. My grandfather, most of the Mauritians that came over would work on the sugarcane fields as sort of semi-skilled labor, so they wouldn't be, you know, chopping the cane anymore. They were milling the sugar, and then he became used to light the gas lamps in the city. But my grandfather, he was a tailor.
I mean, in your piece for the Sharjah Biennale recently, you very actively explored these histories, right? So you did a piece called "Anyway the Wind Blows," in which these histories were sort of borne out through complex sort of narratives or non-linear narratives,
right? Yeah, precisely. You know, exactly. So not the non-linear at all. I mean, if you speak into to beings in other dimensions and consulting people who do the same. I mean, it's obviously, it's not going to be a straight fucking line. So, and and that's what I'm really intrigued about at this moment. I just finished, I'm still working with it. The Kampala Biennale is broken up into studios, and Simon Jebi's curating it, but now we've gone online or whatever. But so we couldn't physically be in Kampala for the show, and so what I've done is I've gone back to the cave, and back to the cave is my mother's side, right? So it's looking at a cave painting. Why did we go into these places? And some of them are really difficult to get into. Like, you have to crawl on your belly. And I was speaking to a friend of mine. He's in archaeology, and he was one of the first colored rock bands called Nine, and now he's a doctor of archaeology. So we say he's now the ultimate rock star. So and he was saying that the acoustics in these spaces were selected quite deliberately. So when you're clapping and you're stomping and you're singing the resonance does something very particular. There's like also sound healing and then you've got the images, and some of them have the images on the walls. So I was like, okay, why did we start doing this? This was before museums, before galleries, before we wanted to fucking make names for ourselves. We were doing this with an innate, there was an innate, not even desire, reasoning or impetus. So my current kind of conceptual positioning, I guess, is going back to the cave, and trying to understand what was the fundamental reasons for us wanting to make and express in these ways. And then, the oldest work that they found is in South Africa, in the Blombos cave. So, so that's kind of where my space is at the moment.
Let's talk about literature a bit. Which writers or poets do you most return to?
Frantz Fanon, mainly Black Skins, White Masks, and Dr. Francis Cress Welsing's ISIS Papers, and Lesego Ramapolkeng, who's a South African poet and a really good friend of mine. And I find that they sort of my compass, in a way, whenever I kind of get distracted by all the other sort of fluff and the kind of wannabe glam glass shit, it's what is the fundamental reason why I'm doing this? And for me, they, especially Fanon and the ISIS Papers were fundamental attacks on white supremacy, and I mean, there's an element of absurdity within the ISIS Papers that I quite enjoy. I'm not sure if I entirely believe some of it, but I quite enjoy the fact that it exists to give me an alternative to the mega narrative, because there's one thing I've never been able to get my head around, and that is white supremacist hatred, and that's, that started like from, I suppose, even before I entered that convent school. So research for me is not just in the book form and in the written form. It's also in the oral form. I grew up listening to stories, which were more kind of bravado and bullshit, and now and again you get good content, and a lot of it was repetitive. So like friends would hang out and they'd talk about what they did the weekend before. And so when I started studying at university and came across post-colonial theory, and I fucking loved it so much, I wanted to tell everybody, we'd go out and go clubbing, and nobody wanted to fucking be near me, because all I would do was start speaking, in post-colonial. And the thing is, I had this academic tongue that was developing as well, so nobody fucking understood what I was saying, And then I was like, okay, I need to neuter this. I need to reconfigure this, and then being exposed to other African artists who even though, of course, some of them had studied internationally, whatever, they were still playing the game of being the African, and I mean, I call it Khoonin, with Khoon, ing, because it's something that I've also consciously done. I mean, it's a means to an end. I hate speaking in the kind of speak of the day, it's like this performing blackness and performativity and all of these fucking box ticking, the criteria is I also believe that art creates theory. it also can utilize it. But when you've consumed the theory, you internalize it. It becomes something else. It mutates, and then when you create the work, you've created an entirely new, evolved form of what that theory was initially. And that's really what art should do. It shouldn't be fucking illustration, of the theory.
Let's talk about music. Which music or other audio do you listen to while you're working?
At the moment, I'm listening to a radio station called YFM, which was started in the 90s by some friends of mine. And, it was very kind of black conscious. It was fucking sexy as hell. It was like in the rainbow period, literally in that Mandela period of the Rainbow Nation. It was, that twilight space where everything has just got that beautiful glow. It's like a golden, we all had that. All of our eyesight was that, and then the honeymoon was fucking over. And then things started to get corrupted and then mutated into all these other things. And I didn't really like what YFM was after, I think it started off as Soweto Radio. And then it became YFM, and there was a magazine attached to it, which was really amazing. And then everything got dumbed down, and it was almost like it was a conscious. Actually, I know it was conscious because friends of mine who were journalists of the magazine said they were called in by the major publishing house, and they were told what they could and could not do anymore, and they literally had to dumb everything down. And now it's actually picked up, but there's still a little bit of I don't want to say superficial, just kind of glossy, glammy, kind of poser kind of element, things to an ish little bit there and there. But what I really love is the way that they navigate that space, because clearly that sort of embargo is still on, kind of dumbed down, the youth. But these kids that are on, I mean, I shouldn't say they're kids because I don't want to say people are kids. It fucking ages me. They are just so incredibly witty and smart, and you can see that that's also the product of a multiracial, a melange kind of education. I mean, they're in the space where everybody, it's not the separation of races again. Like just, I mean, one of the DJs, I was asking a friend if he thinks that what this kid's doing is blackface, because he's white, but when I first heard him, I thought he was black. And he speaks like several South African languages, I think, and he's just so hilariously funny. And, and I was like, damn, I'm so dated in the manner in which I'm also interrogating his integrity. That's so audacious. And, the music is incredible. It's local, it's continental, it's global. And also, there was such an amazing mix last night. This guy was mixing sort of old school hip hop and contemporary Afrobeat. It was fucking kick ass. I could not stop dancing. If you'd asked me like 2-3 months ago, I was listening to jazz and I used to listen to deep house like back in the early 2000s, and that's where I found my soul. I was like, I was like 5 out of 6 days. What was it? Hang on, the club opened on Tuesday. Yeah, so Monday it was closed. So yeah, Monday, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night until Sunday afternoon. I was on the dance floor. No drugs, no alcohol, just deep house. And I never wore the same outfit twice.
You use music quite a lot in your work, don't you? Can we talk about that work that you made for the Philharmonie in Berlin, where you asked a choir to sing a German version of Downpresser Man by Peter Tosh, and then beat them as they did it?
Yeah. So the concept was, so I'd found out that it had been built, I mean, it's common knowledge that it was built on top of a location where I think 500,000 or 150,000 somehow people were eugenicized. And so at the time I was working on this theory, and I'd spoken to another psychic in Canada who told me that there was a force field that covers the earth. And I've got this tendency to research at the most extremes as I can possibly find. So I was researching Alex Jones at the time, And I was quite interested in the space where the extreme left wing and the extreme right wing meet, because there's a crossover in some of their, perceptions, let's say. And so he had a show where he was talking about this being a prison planet, and then I found some other link somewhere else where there was some description about the vibration and incarceration of the English language, of the way that we speak, as opposed to indigenous languages. I was thinking of the way that the vibration of sounds and words can change things. And so my theory was that the sounds that were being generated in the Philharmonie were so incarcerated by its structure that it, the sort of Western classical music was so incarcerating that the vibrations of the sounds, because of their limitation, when you go to other sort of indigenous instruments, for example, they have a different range and a different kind of musicality. So I wanted to disrupt that space. I wanted to liberate it more than disrupt it. So my theory was that these spirits were still stuck in the Philharmonie, and they needed to get out. And so I needed to crack a hole in the shield. And this would be an incredible, powerful location to do it, because in my mind, the sort of Romanesque, Freemasonic, whatever, the establishment had created objects and structures on spaces that cross particular meridians, and those are power meridians. And so this Philharmonie space is obviously on a power meridian, cross and so crosshair basically. And so if I could use it as a weapon, weaponize it by changing the vibration that it wasn't ordained to create, I could cause a crack in the shield and liberate our spirits that are incarcerated. Because one of the concepts was that, it was also almost like reincarnations, like we die, become alive, So we never become intergalactic beings once we come here. I mean, that was a theory I was playing with back in, 2012, 2013. I've moved on. But I just kind of sort of love this idea of using the space of fantasy and possibility, or sci-fi, whatever, to kind of disrupt. So I got them to sing Down Presser Man, and I had it translated in German. And you can't sing reggae. I don't know. I've never heard reggae in German. I never heard German reggae.
Back to absurdism,
Yeah. And so I proceeded to kind of liberate their spirits, but I wasn't hitting them in order to hurt them. I was beating them with a sort of cupped hand, like with a cupped hand, in order to liberate their spirits too. So it's that space that art occupies, which can be really dangerous, between occultism and alchemy, and you don't want to cross over into that space. Like that's the trick. That's what art's supposed to do. It's supposed to be the space of temperance for extreme magic. You're supposed to just pull back a bit, before it becomes something else.
Is there a particular discipline in your daily working life that you see as a sort of essential ritual?
I found that lying on my tummy, whether in the bath or in bed, is a really good way of refining the work. And I figured it's because the navel connects, because your navel was the essential point, that connected you to your life source, your placenta, your mother, and it connects directly into your stomach. So, this is why I'm validating it in my mind, or trying to understand it. So I'm picking up the earth's energy through my navel, which is why I'm getting the information. And then I was thinking the other day about how I was going to answer this and explain this. And I was thinking there's this thing called the Akashic text, where you sort of tap in, and it's almost like every life you've ever lived, everything you've ever going to do, everything you've ever done, and it's all kind of there, scripted. And so if you tap into that source, you can you find the information that's kind of readily available for all of us. So Yeah, but I find that like when I lay on my tummy, it's quite extraordinary. Like things really, they just they become tighter, more refined, a lot more honed, a lot more polished. I've got to do it several times over the course of making a work, depending on how I'm making that work. So if it's more process building, physical making of works that aren't just sort of prop based, it takes a while for the information to kind of download,
If you could live with one work of art, what would it be?
There's a place just 45 minutes outside of Johannesburg. From what I remember, it's called Redan. And if you take the off ramp, you drive a bit. And it's located in kind of an obscure location, and what it is just these flat rocks that have gravings, and they call them pickings, which is basically where the rock has been chipped more than sort of cut, of rock art that I don't know what the date is, a few thousand years ago. And I used to go there quite often. I went a couple of times by myself, which is not advisable. But I went with a friend of mine, and he was like, "Can we take off our clothes and lay on the rocks?" And we took off our clothes and we lay on these rocks. It's completely, it's out in the open, and it's just incredibly beautiful. And just to be charged by these ancient objects, it's probably like one of the best museum spaces. So
do you need to transport that entire environment into your own space somehow in order to live with it?
No, I won't. I know that location's way too important. And and probably like the Philharmonie, it's it's a specific location and particular vibration point and all that shit. But it's like also, I would probably want to build my house to encapsulate it. I would move there. I wouldn't. Yeah, no.
Okay. And lastly, what's art for?
Oh, it's for everything. It's for life. It's for medicine. It's going back to the cave again, as to why we did that. Why did we paint on walls? It wasn't just to document things. Koya said to me they used menstrual blood in some of the paintings, and that fucking changed the whole scape of what those paintings were for me. And I think, I think that's where the answer lies, is in that really fundamental space of what art is. It's for joy, it's for healing and pleasure and sustenance. God help us if we don't have any of it. It's so absolutely crucial for our beings and our developments as good people. We need more good people to be validated, and I think just the fundamentals of who we are. It's really it's DNA thing. That's really what it is.
Tracey, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, this is lovely. Thanks, Pete.
Tracey Rose, Shooting Down Babylon, is at Zeitz in Cape Town from the 17th of February to the 29th of August. And that's it for this episode. Please subscribe to A Brush With wherever you're listening, and do give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. And do also subscribe to our other podcast, The Week in Art, and look at the latest big art world stories, the top shows and the key issues every Friday. You can find us on Twitter at Tan Audio and on Facebook and Instagram, of course. Production, editing and sound design on A Brush With are by David Clack, and the producers of the Art Newspaper podcasts are Julia Mihauska and Amy Dawson. Thanks to Henrietta Bentel, Daniela Hathaway and Kabir Jalal. Huge thanks to Tracey Rose. We'll be back next week with A Brush With the Danish artist Tal R. Bye for now. This episode of A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects. Download Bloomberg Connects today and discover cultural institutions on demand.